Last year, we concluded our talk with a specific challenge that we identified, and that is our work is being motivated and informed by Buddhist philosophy of flourishing and virtues of wisdom and compassion. And the challenge that we identified was, why would we want to apply Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist theory to flourishing in the context of romantic relationships, which is what we're studying? Buddhist practitioners, in a traditional sense, don't have a particular concern with romance. So why would we care about this? Well, it turns out that mindful marriage is the latest craze in the mindfulness movement, and I have a couple examples of how this is showing up in popular culture. So this was an article that just came out, I think it was maybe last week or a week or two, in the New Yorker. Jared and Ivanka Trump's Guide to a Mindful Marriage, and they have some tips for us. First is don't be born poor. And here's another one that I handpicked. Love isn't about money, influence, or pretending to walk in slow motion together across the White House lawn. It's about glancing across a crowded reception at the other person, smiling shyly because both of you know that nobody can even remember who Eric or Donald Jr. is married to. There's a few others in the article, so you can take a look at that. And Ivanka Trump has 7 tips for mindfulness on her website. Now, regardless of your politics, I think this is just pointing to a larger trend in our society that mindfulness is becoming this popular solution to just about every problem, and romantic relationships are one of those problems. Here's another example. There was a website called BD Monk, the Best Dressed Monk, that sold high retail clothing to the mindful man. And as you can see, the mindful man is very attractive, even at an old age. Now, the next part of this story is that this website is no longer up. I looked at it last night and it was down, so they must have gone out of business. It must have been a bad idea. So maybe there's something that Buddhist philosophy can contribute to understanding the role of mindfulness in promoting good relationships. And that's what our project is about. So I'm going to do my best to stand in for John and do a little bit of philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, and just give you a refresher of what our project is about. And I'm not going to talk too much about the deep integration, except to identify a particular couple of challenges that have come up and tell you how that's impacted our project, and then go over some of the progress and where things stand and plans for going forward. So here's the background, and this is being informed by Mahayana Buddhist perspectives and Tibetan Buddhist perspectives of Dzogchen and Mahamudra. In this perspective, there are 2 key virtues that characterize a Buddha, or an awakened one, just a term for the maximal state of flourishing. And in this perspective, you need wisdom and compassion. And we've heard a lot about wisdom and compassion over the past couple days, but I'll say how we understand it from this Buddhist perspective. Wisdom means to see things as they are. So to see something in its true reality without imposing our own narratives or our own constructed ideas onto what something is. So in the context of interpersonal interactions or interpersonal relationships, as you're walking around in the world, you see people, and you, based on who you are in society and based who they are, you might apply certain labels to them. You might understand them in a certain way, like, oh, that person's just a janitor, that person's just a grad student, that person's just an undergrad, right? We have these societal relationships and we label people based on these relationships, but those labels are ultimately just some limited, narrow framework for understanding another person. It doesn't capture the depth of their I-ness, as we've heard about earlier. Wisdom means to see something as it truly is, so to see another person as they truly are. Buddhists understand us, all of us ordinary people, as being caught in the grips of ignorance. We tend to see others in limited ways, and we tend to see ourselves in limited ways. So we're deluded about the nature of identity. Compassion is engagement with the world focused on reducing other suffering It's a self-transcendent state in which you are concerned entirely with reducing the suffering of others. And we need both. We can't just have one or the other. One might contribute to some level of flourishing, but the maximal level of flourishing is really manifested when we have both. So the aim for our first year was to take these ideas and explore how could these connect with the scientific literature that already existed on relationships, and where might there be new ideas that Buddhism can contribute. And this was the focus of our submission for the Journal of Moral Education paper. And some of the key things that we identified are that Buddhism suggests that we need to have some awareness of our own narratives about the self and narratives about the other. We need to construct narratives to exist in the world functionally, but we need to have awareness that those narratives are constructed and not necessarily capturing the true identity of another person. And then we also talked about the importance of self-transcendence and care and the need to have a sense of a positive care and concern for others. So I'm not going to say too much more about this because I want to get into the empirical project and talk about our measures and how we're actually trying to test these ideas. So here's the aims for year 2. First, we want to investigate wisdom and compassion among couples using experience sampling techniques. So we heard from Blaine's group about the virtues, the benefits of using experience sampling. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and how we implemented it. And what we're really interested here is looking at variation. We wanted to just see, can we come up with ways to measure wisdom and compassion, and is it useful for identifying variation among couples, among different couples? And then test, do these measures actually impact or predict flourishing using standardized measures from social psychology? So the true novel piece is trying to come up with these experience sampling measures to assess wisdom and compassion and seeing then if they actually predict outcomes that we already know from previous work are associated with good outcomes in relationships. So here's an overview or a map of what the couples do in our study. They come for an initial laboratory visit where we have them do some implicit association tests. So we take measures of reaction times that are supposed to give some insight into their non-conscious or automatic evaluations of their partner. And based on previous work, we know that these automatic attitudes are predictive of the status of the relationship. It actually predicts whether couples break up 6 months later. We then take some classic self-report measures, so relationship satisfaction and some other well-being measures. And then each of our couples does 8 days of experience sampling using an app, smartphone app that we developed, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail a little bit later. And within the app, they get random alerts. So for 8 days, they get 7 alerts, just randomly distributed throughout their day, and then they respond to a variety of self-report questions. And at the end of the day, they do a check-in where they reflect on sort of how the day went, if they had any major conflicts with their partner, if they had particularly positive interactions with their partner. And in that way, we're trying to capture significant events that the random sampling maybe didn't capture. So I'm going to be focusing on this element of the project in the presentation today. We also have a component of dyadic psychophysiology. So at the end, after the experience sampling, partners come in together and they have interactions and discuss area of concern within their relationship, and they also talk about positive things within their relationship. And we're interested in looking at to what extent partners are influencing each other using measures of psychophysiology, similar to some of the measures that Christina presented yesterday. Before I go into the experience sampling, I'll just say a little bit more about those methods. So here you see this is two of my undergraduate research assistants in the lab modeling what the setup is like when our couples are in the lab. So we're trying to create a sort of environment that feels a little bit more natural. We don't just put them in kind of an artificial cubicle. We try to put them in a living room type scenario so couples feel comfortable talking to each other. And one of the pieces that we're really excited about is this response to positive news paradigm. So in the relationship literature, a classic finding is that the manner in which we respond to the positive news of our partner is highly predictive of the outcome and the satisfaction of that relationship. And response to positive news is actually more indicative than response to negative news. In fact, if we're supportive towards our partners when they're having a negative situation, it can sometimes be bad because it's detrimental to their self-esteem. So response to positive news, if people are really engaged and actively constructive and actively engaged with their partner when positive events happen, it's a sign that their relationship is healthy. So we're doing these behavioral observations of the way people act and also collecting peripheral psychophysiology during these interactions. And the peripheral physiology piece has actually never been done before with the positive news paradigm. So we're really excited to dig into that and see what kind of results come out of that. It's a sort of exploratory part of the project. And again, this data takes quite a lot of time to process, so we're not going to present psychophysiology data in the talk today, but I'll talk a little bit about the analyses that we hope to do with some of that data. So for deep integration this year, for us, what that meant was really getting into the details of designing the smartphone app and then using a smartphone app to actually collect the experience sampling data. And so after the SMV meeting last year, we then had a meeting in Wisconsin. Christy and I traveled to go see John at the Center for Healthy Minds. And we spent 2 days really getting into developing a smartphone app. We designed the questions, and we came up with a whole scheme of the types of questions we wanted to use to assess wisdom and compassion. Then Christy and I went back to Boston, and we spent a couple months really fine-tuning and designing the app. And then we sent it off to our company that we've worked with in the past to actually program and design the app. So I actually wanted to say something about obstacles here because our obstacles happened at this stage. So I'm going a little bit out of order from the outline that I said, but it's, I think, instructive for just anytime you're working with technology in this capacity for research. So the technology part actually took much longer than we expected. We designed this app and we submitted it to the company in August. And then there was, a variety of delays with the company and the university agreeing on their contract. And then once it was finalized, it also took the company longer to produce the app than we expected. So we started data collection about 2 months beyond when we initially planned to. So we're still doing data collection now, but we're almost finished. We've collected data with 40 couples, and we're actually now up to, as of today, probably around 50, and we'll be hoping to get to 60 before the end of July. So in this app that we designed, couples are alerted randomly, and it includes a variety of quantitative measures and open-ended qualitative measures, and it combines random alerts and end-of-day diary. And one of the new pieces that is newly developed by the company, which was something else we're really excited about, is that partners get alerts in sync together, even if they're not in the same space. So partners can start the study, they leave. Whether or not they're in person with each other, they get apps, so we can really get a sense of what's happening in the minds of two individuals at the same time, regardless of if they're in the same space or not. Here's some screenshots of the app. So wanted to give you a sense of this because it's also been really successful in terms of us getting really good compliance, good response rates, and very low attrition within the sample. So we design it so that couples can decide on their own period, their own window of time when they receive alerts. So they choose a 14-hour window. So 8 a.m. is the default, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And we use this QR code to sync the phone so the partners are getting alerts in sync for 8 days. And then they also get these sort of feedback indices on their phone to tell them how they're doing. and we instruct them that we want them to get up to 64 responses completed over the 8 days. We want them to have a response rate above 75, and they'll get some bonus cash if they get over 90%. And we also require that the response time is actually less than 15 minutes. So this was a screenshot from my own phone. You can see that I'm a pretty bad participant when I'm using this app. So we designed the app, and then we piloted it with a group of naive undergraduates, about 15 to 20 undergraduates, to make sure that the wording and everything made sense. And Blaine nicely alluded to that issue as well with psychologists developing measures. We had to make sure that it was sensible to normal people. Okay, so here's a flowchart of the types of questions that appear in the app. And actually, before I do that, I wanted to mention you can download this app yourself if you're interested. It's called, in the iPhone store, it's called SciT Research. And then once you download it, you have to put in some credentials to unlock it. So it's NEU for Northeastern University, and then the password is 1881881. And this is the password for the pilot version. So anything that you do with it won't actually come into our study. It will just be pilot stuff. So if you're interested in checking out the app, you can do that. And I'd love to hear, if you have any thoughts, we'd be curious to hear what you think. So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but just to give you a high level, we use the app in the random alerts to try to get a sense of each individual's sort of psychological experience at that moment. So we ask them about their current mood, so valence and arousal, and specific emotional states. And then we also want to get a sense of the context of their relationship. So are they with their partner or not in the same physical space? If they're not in the same physical space, are they interacting with their partner in some way? So are they communicating with their partner, maybe with text message or phone? Or perhaps, if they weren't doing any of those, were they just thinking about their partner? And we're using these to try to get a sense of the degree of just social embeddedness or social connectivity. You could imagine that some partners who maybe don't have a very strong relationship just don't think about each other very often, or they're not embedded with each other very much. So we're really trying to get a sense of the sort of social closeness, even when they're not together. And then depending on how they responded to those social connectivity questions, we then have a series of follow-up questions that assess their experience of how they're relating to their partner in their mind. So I'm going to specifically focus on these sets of questions. If they didn't happen to be with their partner, or they weren't even thinking about their partner wasn't sort of actively present in their mind at that moment, we still ask them to just provide some kind of response to the question, what comes to mind when you think about your partner right now? So if you're in a relationship, and if you're in a relationship and I just ask you, what comes to mind when you think about your partner right now? Something pops up in your mind, and then we would ask you to put that into the app. So I'm not going to go into the daily diary, but the purpose of the daily diary, again, is to try to capture significant events that are happening in the day that might not otherwise been captured from these random alerts. And we have some of the same types of questions. So here's where we're at. We have 20 couples with complete data as of the end of May, and we've run about 10 more in June, and we're going to continue running in July. And this is the nature of the sample. Most of them happen to be younger couples. We're on a college campus. It's just easier to get undergraduate couples to come in. It's a little harder to get community samples. But we're also actively advertising to try to get some more diversity in our sample. The average length of relationship is 1.5 years. We've had 37 heterosexual couples and 3 same-sex couples. And as you can see, our response rates have been really great. So we've only lost 3 couples over the course of the data collection, and this is something we're really happy with. We're asking them to do 8 surveys a day for 8 days, and the daily diary takes about 10, 15 minutes, so it's quite an intensive project for them, and we've had a really great response rate. And our average response rate of the surveys themselves is over 90%, which again is a very excellent return for experience sampling studies. We've had over 4,000 surveys completed, and we're continuing to collect data through the end of July. So now I want to talk specifically about measuring wisdom, and here we're not conceptualizing wisdom as full-blown wisdom as a Buddha would experience, but we're talking about just one aspect of wisdom that can happen in ordinary cognition with ordinary people, and John has conceptualized this as de-reification and has done some work with other people in the field of contemplative studies on de-reification. But the idea with de-reification is and again, this is something that is experienced on a continuum. So it's not categorical. It's something that some people might be at a particular level, and they might have sort of a set point, but would fluctuate around it from time to time or from moment to moment. And the opposite of de-reification, or reification, is indicated by attachment or rigidity to our thoughts. So having some particular thought and being totally identified or immersed in it and experiencing it as completely real, completely rigid. These thoughts might be particularly sticky, so they might be something that a person ruminates on a lot or clings to, or has a certain sense of confidence in it, or even a certain sense of essentialism about the thought. And so what we've done to try to get at this is 2 approaches. One, this question of what comes to mind when you think about your partner, just in an open-ended way. And then we ask people to evaluate or rate their own experiences. So they rate the intensity of these thoughts, the frequency of these thoughts, so to what extent they occur repeatedly, their confidence in the accuracy of the thought, so how much they think it sort of captures who their partner really is. Another element which we don't have that I haven't put in the talk is making judgments about the other person's traits. So the couples will also judge things like the extent to which their partner is needy or generous or proud or optimistic, and to what extent do these trait judgments show some consistency over time, regardless of situations or context, is another way of getting at reification of traits of another person. So here's what it looks like when the partners respond to this question of thoughts in the moment about each other. They get this open-ended box, and they put in their thoughts, and then afterward they rate them. And again, they're doing this 7 times a day over the course of 8 days. So we tell participants to use as many words as they can to describe their partner in the moment. It can be a phrase. It doesn't need to be a complete sentence, just whatever comes to mind. Here's some examples from some people. So she's at work and she didn't get a lot of sleep, so she's probably tired. She's still pissed and just making up excuses for a lot of things, and I'm trying my best to figure out, and I just can't. A little bit self-absorbed. He has a lot of free time and doesn't understand my stress levels. I wonder why he doesn't have a sense of urgency. Hope she's safe driving home. I hope she answers the survey question before it expires. So a couple things we want to point out here are, in this first example, this is in some way getting at de-reification because there's some situational explanation for the behavior. There's not necessarily confidence in a particular trait as driving the behavior or a particular aspect of the other person. There's a sort of sense of openness about what's happening. Maybe a sense of more perspective about what's going on. Whereas in this case, he has a lot of free time and doesn't understand my stress levels. This is maybe an example of a particular thought moment where there's more reification occurring. It's sort of more from a self-interested perspective, sort of not understanding what the other person's experience or situation might be. So the first question with this data is just what do the distributions look like? What kind of responses are we getting? And what we found so far is that we're getting a really nice normal distribution from a lot of our data, and we're really happy with this. So what you're looking at here is a distribution of couples. So I'm not plotting or showing you individual data because this data is non-independent. So it means that the couple's data is yoked. They're influencing each other because they're in relationship, and so we're looking at this at a dyadic level. So each unit is a couple. So you can see that for this rating of their thoughts as emotionally tense, the majority of people are right in the middle, and we get some on the low end and some on the high end. We get a similar result with the evaluation question, this thought occurs a lot. And again, this is regardless of thought content, so we're not yet considering whether the thought is positive or negative in valence, for example. This is across all thoughts. We're getting normal distribution in this sort of rumination about the thought. Similar again, too, with the evaluation of this thought is accurate about my partner. So that's an example of some of the reification questions. So next is some of the compassion or self-transcendence questions. And here what we're looking at are a few different elements or dimensions that could be indicative of compassion. One is prioritizing other over self, so putting another person's needs before one's own. Being responsive, so actually doing something to address another person's needs. So not just desiring for another person, but actually taking sort of the active action to help somebody. Having a sense of affection or care toward the partner. So this one, we actually, in our deep integration process, in our sort of going back and forth between Christy and I, and with John, and also with our undergrads, we had a lot of debate about what's the appropriate word and terminology. We wanted to capture just a sense of care and affection with which we ended up in. But in the Buddhist terminology, they use the words of endearment, or sort of sensing all others as endearing, or all others as cute or attractive in a way. And we had a lot of conversation and debate and trying to figure out what's the best way to capture this. We looked to the relationship science scales that already exist, and one of the common words was cherishing. To what extent do you cherish your partner? And that also felt kind of awkward, and so we ended up with affection and care. We also used a question of outcomes wanted for a partner. So, this was an open-ended question, outcomes wanted for partner. And again, this is another example of our deep integration where we went back and forth. Christy and I worked on looking through the literature and trying to come up with, in the sort of responsiveness and relationship literature, what are some of the things that are commonly measured in relationships? What do things that partners do for each other? And we presented that list to John, and he thought one of the problems with it is that it didn't include anything negative. It didn't encompass for the fact that sometimes partners might want their partners to actually feel bad, or they might want something bad for their partner to happen. So we ended up dropping the list and going with an open-ended approach. And I'll come back to show you some examples of how his assumption was actually verified. So here's some results from these compassion questions. Care and affection, again, we have nice normal distributions. And I'm showing you the couple data, but we also get normal distributions for the individual distributions as well, if we're plotting just individual scores. Here's, I generally felt concerned about my needs versus balancing our needs versus my partner's needs. And I generally responded to my partner's needs, so actually doing something. Now, I did want to point out another question that we have is, in contrast to this, is evaluating whether they perceive their partner actually was responsive to the self. And we also get a normal distribution here. But if you look at the scales, one thing that's interesting is that there's a social loafing phenomenon going on here. So as an individual, if I were rating this, just as an example, if I were rating these questions, what this is showing is that I'm saying I generally respond to my partner's needs. And a lot of people are above 0.5, and we have quite a few who are at 0.7 or 0.8. So the majority of the time, they are being responsive to their partner's needs. But if you look at the distribution for my partner responding to me, the distributions are lower. There's less people in this upper region here. And this is a classic social loafing kind of phenomenon that happens in social psychology and is bad in relationships. This sometimes is one of the key things that leads to difficulties in relationships. So the last compassion question I wanted to mention is this open-ended approach to just trying to understand the motivations underlying compassion. How is it they want their partner to feel? So if I'm doing something for my partner, let's say I'm washing the dishes for my partner, that in itself might be a pro-social action if I'm washing the dishes so she doesn't have to. But what's the intention underlying that? Maybe I want her to feel relaxed, and maybe I want her to have a night off. But alternatively, maybe I want her to feel bad. Maybe I want her to feel guilty because I'm washing the dishes, and I do a better job than she does at washing the dishes. So this was where John really came back to us and provided with some, I think, valuable insight that we didn't want to make assumptions that doing something for another person is always pro-social. So here is a word cloud of the data. And again, this is about 4,000 different responses. And the most common, I was actually very heartened by this. The most common responses were things like, I wanted my partner to feel loved. I wanted my partner to feel cared for, appreciated, calm, relaxed. So generally, people want their partners to just feel this sense of being cared for. But as you can see, there are some things that are negative. So I wanted my partner to feel guilty. I wanted my partner to feel bad. I wanted my partner to feel sorry. Sometimes people see the one up here that says stressed, but that one is actually, there was a lot that said I wanted my partner to feel less stressed. So generally they're positive, but there are instances in which people actually want their partners to feel negative or feel bad. So the more important question, well actually before I go down this route of looking at predicting relationship satisfaction, I do want to say that we are quite happy with these initial results, even though they're just descriptive statistics, just to look at the sort of nature of our sample of what's coming in. We are getting a nice distribution of average experiences on these questions. And if we plot the standard deviations or plot the variability in couples, we also get a nice distribution. So these examples are all means for couples, but if we plot the standard deviations and the variability, we also get a nice distribution. So some couples, for example, on this question, my partner generally responded to my needs. Some couples tend to choose or rate the same response every time very consistently, and some couples are much more variable in the way they respond to this. So there's something interesting going on there. So I keep referring to Blaine's talk, but there are so many interesting parallels and overlaps, and he really sort of nailed this next chart that I'm going to show when he mentioned that relationship satisfaction questions tend to be skewed. So here are couple satisfaction scores on two traditional relationship satisfaction measures, the relationship assessment scale and the couples satisfaction index. So what you see is the majority of people are really happy. The higher scores indicate that they're more satisfied, and fewer people report not being happy. So one thing that we're going to do, and we didn't initially plan to do this, but one thing that we're going to do going forward is continue to follow up with our couples over the next 6 months and even into next year. We're going to just track them with simple surveys to see if they're still together and assess their relationship satisfaction. And we believe that there will be some interesting variance to predict in terms of who stays together and who breaks up. So here are some correlation outcomes to predict relationship satisfaction. So what you see is that, and we have the reification questions up above and the compassion questions down below. one thing that we see, which is not what we're predicting, is that the more that they have frequent thoughts and sort of rated as accurate thoughts, the higher the relationship satisfaction is. So it could be the case that the content really matters. Like if there's a particular negative thought or particular positive thought, that might go in a different direction. But the variability is even more powerfully predictive. So the more variable they are in their sort of sense of reification, the more strongly it is tied to relationship satisfaction. So it could be the case that having positive thoughts about the partner and having some sense of frequency and confidence and accuracy and intensity of those sort of caring and positive thoughts could actually be a very good thing. Whereas if they're not worrying and intense and frequent about negative thoughts, it'd be a good thing. So it makes sense that there'd be a positive relationship between variability there and relationship satisfaction. We see the opposite with the compassion question. So here you see generally some positive relationships between mean compassion ratings and satisfaction. So this is admittedly a pretty simplistic kind of analysis. We're just trying to get a sense of what our sample is looking like and what the data is coming in. So I want to say sort of what our more complex analysis will look like once we have a complete data. So we're going to use this. This is actor-partner interdependence model. This is a very common sort of standard approach to measuring dyadic data using structural equation modeling. And so we can't use ANOVA or regression in this type of data because it would violate the assumption of non-independence, or the assumption of independence. So we have to use something to model partners together. And the really great thing about this type of analysis is it allows us to operationalize relationships. So this path here is person one's own wisdom and compassion predicting a relationship outcome. But the path here is person one's wisdom and compassion predicting the other person's relationship outcome, so in terms of satisfaction or actual behavior. And this is a way to really operationalize the impact of another person on the self, the operationalize of a relationship. And it would potentially show the effect of one person's wisdom and compassion on the other person's outcomes, controlling for your own levels of wisdom and compassion on the outcomes. And we'll use a similar type of analysis for measuring and quantifying synchrony in the physiology paradigm, looking at cross-lagged effects. So what's the effect of person two's heart rate on the other person at a later time point, for example. We also want to do some open-ended coding, some qualitative coding of the open-ended data. And one of the interesting things that looks like it might be particularly relevant is looking at essentialized versus contextualized type of thinking. So essentialized would be, again, sort of having a thought of another person that is treated as if it's sort of a permanent feature of that person. It's the essence of who they are, versus having a thought that captures another person in a particular context and that embeds features of the situation that they're in. So I wanted to show some examples where this already is looking apparent. So here's an example of a dissatisfied couple. And you might not think that they're dissatisfied just by looking at it, but you'll notice that the language is very sort of simplistic, and it's very sort of context independent. So things like happy, missing him, nothing in particular, stable, reliable, content, nothing, hope he's studying. So there's a lot of trait judgments in both positive and negative directions, and there's not a lot of sort of thought about the situation that the other person is. It's very just sort of treating thoughts about the other person's traits. Here's an example of a satisfied couple. You'll see the language is much more rich. There's a lot more reference to particular situations. So, hope she's safe driving home. I get to see her in an hour. Look forward to spending time one-on-one. she's amazing. I'm going to miss her a lot when I go on co-op. And the girl talking about the guy, is good with people, standing up for science, adorable, wonderful. So there's a lot more variability and information related to the context that the person's in. So in terms of obstacles, I've already talked about the sort of timeline of developing a smartphone app and the difficulties that presented us. But we've, in a very short time, been able to collect a lot of data, and we've been very successful in maintaining a very good compliance with low attrition. So we'll be on track to finish our data collection very soon and start working on these more complicated analyses and manuscript preparation in the fall. And as I mentioned, we're also looking forward to doing follow-up to actually track our couples to see if they're actually staying together and maintaining relationship satisfaction. In terms of the sort of reflecting on this project and its sort of contribution to our respective fields and conversations with John and Christy, I wanted to just share a couple thoughts. So for psychology, this approach we think is really going to provide a more nuanced understanding of sort of the positive development of relationships and relationship satisfaction. And then for Buddhist studies, one of the really tractable positive benefits of this work is taking these abstract concepts, wisdom and compassion, which are usually understood in terms of the path of enlightenment and nirvana. How can they actually be grounded in an everyday situation, in relationships, and actually explain something that's really tangible and important to most people in everyday lives? So I wanted to thank the project team, Christy and John in particular, but also our collaborators, Lisa, Karen, and Wendy. And also I wanted to say that each of us has been really grateful to do this work. We feel like this deep integration process is valuable and is something that we really see as a sort of a career-long project. So we're really grateful to be here and be with the SMV project and look forward to whatever else emerges going forward. So thank you, Darsha and Nancy. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you for a very fun and interesting presentation. I might have missed it. Do you also give some intervention to the couples you dealt with? So, you know what I mean, like, wisdom, compassion, wisdom, did you?
We actually didn't do any intervention.
Any intervention.
Now, it's possible that it's very possible that this experience sampling type approach could be an intervention in itself, just by reflecting on your relationship and thinking about these questions of, we don't sort of specifically frame them as compassion questions to the couples, but just reflecting on your own patterns of caring and responsiveness to your partner might sort of change the way you interact with your partner. Or it might, maybe it might reveal some things that you don't like about your relationship, and maybe it will have some negative effects. So that's something that we didn't intentionally try to make it an intervention, and this is actually a classic question for experience sampling studies in general. Does reflecting on your experience have some impact on changing your experience? And there's many others in the room who could speak to this as well, but generally the field has shown that most of the times experience sampling studies don't have this sort of intervention type effect on people.
Okay. Yeah.
But
so, yeah.
Sorry, just to say one more thing. In terms of future work, we would really love to do an intervention study where couples would maybe get some meditation training, and then we could use this app to track their experience before and after doing the training.
Right. So when I look at your examples, the first thing come to my mind is if you have to be that compassionate, and you know what I mean. If you have to be that compassionate to your partner, I think that relationship should be doomed. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I don't know if that's what I'm saying is what I meant, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, sometimes you have to work really, really hard to give love and compassion to your partner. That is not a really working relationship. So I don't know. I don't know if that's gonna work in the end. If you don't give intervention, and if they don't know how to be mindful and etc. You know what I mean? So that was something came to my mind. And the second thing is if you give the mindfulness or compassionate to themselves, I mean training to themselves, then maybe that's a different story. Like, you know what I mean? So you try to understand and provide understanding what the other the other person feels, and that might work better.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm totally.
No, I think the question in terms of like the sort of the effort of compassion and the sort of maybe the difficulty of engaging compassion on that level is an interesting question. And I think that's also been in my own sort of involvement in this field of the science of compassion, and a long-standing interest and question of trying to understand what compassion is and how does it actually play out in everyday contexts and experiences. Because I think for a lot of people, in the way it's discussed in society, and we have exemplars of compassion like the Dalai Lama, or I'm thinking of the Buddhist examples, but it's sort of this exalted thing. And part of what we're trying to do is understand how does it play out in an everyday situation, not just in really extreme cases of suffering, but just like what does care and responsiveness look like in an everyday relationship. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to study romantic couples, is because it sort of provides an opportunity to look at a relationship where you have some sense, people presumably care about their partners, otherwise they wouldn't have gotten together, so we can try to capture that as it's naturally occurring without an intervention.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. It's great work. Just thinking about my own long-term relationship, and I'm pretty sure the only reason that it survived is because my wife has had deep compassion. And that's not really a joke. It should be, but it's not. The two questions. One is, did you talk with the couples at all about the influences on them from friends or elders whose relationships have served as touchstones for them in the low points? So that's one question. Mm-hmm. The other question is regarding the active interdependence model, the active partner independence model, and will you do some robust model comparison so that you're not assuming that model structure, but actually allowing the data to tell you whether that model structure is actually a better or worse fit than some other plausible models that could be there? I don't know.
Sure. So for the first question about the impact of influential people, like influential parents or caregivers or elders on their own relationship.
Yeah, I was thinking exemplars for them.
Yeah, that's a really important issue. So I didn't get to talk about it in the sort of philosophy overview, but in a traditional Buddhist context where these virtues are developed, in a Buddhist monk practitioner, for example, one of the very first stages or very first elements of their training or their practice is devotion, or ritualistic devotion to a lineage of teachers and gurus and benefactors. So they're sort of seeing themselves becoming part of that lineage, and they're being blessed by the qualities of their gurus, and they're taking on the qualities of their teachers. So what you're asking, I think, is a very central question to this framework. But we don't necessarily, that element doesn't always translate to the West because we're in such an individualistic culture. So I think that's a really important question. We don't have measures to get a sense of their sort of family life or their upbringing. We have sort of the standard attachment questions to look at their experience in close relationships in general. But we don't have specific measures to get at the sort of broader societal or sort of family upbringing that they're in, but that I think would be another great sort of future grant project to do. For the question about the data or the model, I think the biggest thing for us that's on my mind is the construct validity of wisdom and compassion, and do these sort of do these constructs have some unique predictive validity beyond like just basic positive affect or basic negative affect? So that's definitely something that we'll be comparing against.
So really cool stuff. I'm back here. I just had a couple naive questions. One thing that you kept on mentioning over and over is how concerned, or if, I guess it belied a kind of concerned about the normalization of the data, that for the measures you expected the couples to kind of form into a nice normal curve. And I guess one thing is, why should we expect that from couples? I mean, it seems like if you're in a couple, you being in a coupled relationship for some period of time, you might not expect that you're going to have the kind of variation on these measures a priori. So I guess one thing is like, why do we care so much that's normal? But then a separate question that's somewhat related is, and I'm sure you did this, and you may have mentioned in the talk, but did you look at individual differences of couple differences that predicted some of the variability? So one of the things I'm thinking about is how much time you spend with your partner, right? So like if you're in an academic kind of setting, it's like if you're only on like a weekend, see each other every weekend thing, that might really kind of build up a different picture than if, you're in the Shakespearean mode of, what is it, too much proximity builds contempt or something like this? So I didn't know if maybe you looked at those measures or those differences.
Yeah, so on the question of the normality of the data, one reason we were particularly happy with that outcome is because we've done some experience sampling studies with other kinds of measures where we'll get some kind of results where everybody's just very low on the scale, and then there's not much variation to predict, right? Like, it's basically showing that there's a nice variation among our population or among our samples, so we can use that to try to predict other outcomes in the study. On the question of sort of the sense of like spending time together or not, so that's why we, in the, I'll pull this up, in this flow of the survey, we're specifically trying to measure that issue. So were they actually with their partner, yes or no? If not, did they communicate with their partner? Were they thinking about them? Were they, sort of different levels of social connectivity? And there certainly will be, I'm sure there is a lot of individual variation in that type of data. So we haven't looked at that piece yet, but that's certainly something that we're really trying to measure explicitly and believe that it will be predictive of the sense that they're interacting and satisfied with each other.
So just super quick, just so I understand one last time. With the normalization, you want it because you get this nice bit of variation, which means you might be able to predict it, use that to predict certain things.
Yeah.
In what way do you want to predict things? Because you can't, the samples aren't independent, right? So you can't do any fancy ANOVAs or regressions, right? Because regressions are just ANOVAs. And in some sense, so I guess I'm still kind of unclear on that end, but on another end, did you do other tests to make sure, it looked kind of normal, but did you do like further tests to really check if it was normal?
Part of what's going on is that we're just trying to get a sense of what our data is looking like, because we're still collecting data. So we're still collecting data through, next month and part of August. So part of what I'm doing is being a little cautious if I don't want to generalize beyond, what our sample's going to be. And this has been an issue in psychology. There's been a lot of critique of sort of like, p-hacking and this kind of stuff. So we're trying to be cautious with not doing sort of extra analyses and sort of peeking at the data. So really what I'm trying to do is just get a sense of the data. And the reason I'm happy that it's a normal distribution is because it suggests that there are some couples that are low on these measures and some couples that are high, and that's good because it means that we can try to predict. We are sort of going into the study is predicting that there would be variation and that would be predictive of the outcomes that we're measuring in the lab.
Thanks for this talk, Paul. I've been eagerly looking forward to it, and I'm even more eager about the results that you'll have
Thank you.
down the line. I guess one question I have is, it seems to me that today you're presenting, and I know you're very early in the process, so this is not a criticism, but you're presenting pretty much all between persons data, right? I mean, it's average couple
Yeah,
levels
between
on
couples
the
data.
variables, and all the outcomes, are they between persons as well?
Between
So-
couples.
Or between couples, right, yeah. So you're going to have an incredibly rich data set with these
Yeah.
thousands of responses. Can you tell us a little bit about what you plan to do at the within persons level? What are you going to do with all those responses?
Yeah, so it's a complicated data set. There's a lot that we can do, and I'm very interested to have additional conversations about the possibilities here. But I think that another thing that we want to do is look at not just synchrony in the physiology data, but also synchrony in sort of the temporal dynamics of affective experience within couples. So some couples might be more in sync in terms of where they're at in their emotional experience so we can use these sort of dyadic analyses to look at synchrony in affective experience as well. So that's sort of generally the sort of broad framework of analysis that we're looking to do.
And did you say that you have a measure in at the occurrence level of conflict? Like, would you know on a particular day if they'd had some level of conflict or no conflict?
Yeah, so the random alerts are just being sent to them randomly throughout the day, so it may or may not capture something significant that happened, because it's just sort of probing them in this very moment.
Right.
Like, what are you experiencing? So we do that 7 times a day, and then at the end of the day, we ask them to then reflect on significant events that happened during the day.
Okay.
So that could include a very significant conflict or a very significant positive event that we otherwise wouldn't have captured.
Okay.
So I think that's another interesting and really important opportunity to get at these questions of sort of self-transcendence and reification, because they may not be particularly important in sort of dull moments when you're not engaged or interacting with your partner or not having a significant moment. They might really have their power and predictability when they're happening in a more significant situation, like a conflict or a really positive event.
Yeah, that sounds particularly promising, some event-based analyses, and see what you can find about what happens.
Paul, Michael and I are interested in the relationship between selves, and we're interested in thinking about what say humility implies. If humility is a virtue, what sort of thing is a self? And the kind of respectful attitude that oneself takes towards another seems to involve both a conception of one's own nature and a conception of the other person's nature in this relationship. And so I take it it's a Buddhist word, the reification for the bad kind of, I take it, other conception. I'm wondering what you could say about that. Is the word the word reification is a little bit odd from my point of view. It sounds it isn't a word that would trip off my tongue, and so I'm just wondering what the import of that is.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of actually overlap in the work that we're doing. So excited to continue talking on these issues. But I think the sort of simplest way to understand reification as it applies to thinking about other people is, this example of when you're at your work or when you're just walking around in the world, or even like in this room, you're looking out at people and thoughts pop into your mind like, oh, there's the important one, right? there's the president of the university, that's the important person, versus there's the janitor, that person's not important. So these thoughts are coming to your mind, right?
Right.
But those thoughts, they might capture some element of who that person is, but they're not capturing the true reality of that person, right? Like that person's the president of the university, but that person might also be a father or a husband and might have a deep history of aspirations and dreams and goals and sufferings. But in the moment when you see them as just a janitor or just a president, right? And you sort of identify them with that label, that's reification. But the moment in which you drop the label and relate to them in a sort of deeper way, sort of this eye-to-eye level as you were talking about, that's de-reification.
Yeah.
Or discernment is another
Right.
Buddhist term for it.
But is it a sort of realistic positing of the other self? Is it, I mean, you talked about, you used the expression, the depth of a person's I-ness. So is that, what are you seeing when you see the other's I-ness? Or see into it?
Well, from
or
a
what-
Buddhist perspective, you're seeing the other person's Buddha nature, which is their innate or sort of unlimited capacity for awakening and flourishing, their unlimited innate capacity for wisdom and compassion. So from a Buddhist perspective, that's what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I thought this was great. My question is, I'm struck by the fact that I guess all these couples are younger people,
Yeah.
and most of them are dating.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a sense in which the kind of relationship they're in is one in which you're trying to determine whether this is somebody that you're going to spend, maybe the foreseeable, future with, versus somebody that you realize you've made, it's just not working for some reason, and then ultimately it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if that's something that's in your own thinking about, like how to interpret this, and what it means for the sort of data that you're able to gather.
Yeah, I think, and this came up in our talk last year, that wisdom in a relationship could mean having some insight that this person may not be the right one for me, and this person might not be, or this might not be a positive relationship, and having some wisdom and even compassion for another might involve ending that relationship, right, in some sort of positive way. So I think in terms of interpreting that data, I think it's kind of an open question, and we'll have to see what the results are. And I think that's also really the importance of our tracking these couples over the next year to see if they actually stay together and if their relationship is satisfying or not. And so I think I don't have a great answer for you, except that we're going to see what happens and be open to those results.
We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker.